Are we all here? Should we stop? Well, the old rabbi was dying, and the town gathered around to be near him at his death. They brought him out of a small house and on a mat that they were carrying, and they laid him down, and the entire population of the town begins to form around, circle around him. And finally, a young man at the front of the group meekly asks, "Rabbi, do you have any last words of wisdom for us? Is there anything you would like to tell us?" Well, the old man props himself up on his elbow, and with very measured speech he says, "Life is like a river." The people in the second and third rows of the crowd are straining to hear him. They're not quite sure what he says. They can't pick up that gentle voice. So they ask the people in front, "What did he say?" They were told he said, "Life is like a river." Now those further back in the assembly asked those in front of them, "What did he say?" He said, "Life is like a river." The word begins to spread very quickly among all those who are present, as everyone wants to know, what did the rabbi say? At the very edge of the mob, way in the back, stands a man who, upon hearing the message, "Life is like a river," he frowns and he asks the messenger, "What does he mean, life is like a river?" Well, immediately the question begins to travel back along the same path the first words came of the rabbi. What does he mean, life is like a river? The question moves from the rear of the group to the front of the group to that same timid young man who's standing there by the rabbi, and he hears the query. So he advances upon the rabbi once more and he asks, "Rabbi, what do you mean, life is like a river?" The old man struggles to raise his upper torso from the mat, and his eyes only half open. And he speaks with a voice that's very weary. "So, maybe it's not like a river." Well, there's always the temptation, I think, when you give talks like this to a group, to think that you're going to sum everything up for people, and in one brilliant flash, you're going to tell them that life is like a river. Well, I don't pretend to do that this morning. I'm not even sure what life is like a river means. What I would like to do, though, is share with you some thoughts that I've shared with another group fairly recently on the question of Francis and ministry, and to not pretend that I have all the answers about that question either, that I could sum it up for you in some brilliant flash, that ministry is like a river. I can't even pretend that Francis has all the answers about this. It would be like Ed McMahon setting up Johnny Carson on The Tonight Show, saying that, I wish I could say that everything you wanted to know, everything you could possibly ask about ministry is in this talk. But it's not quite that simple. Not only because I have no great insight into the matter, but also because I think we have to admit that Francis doesn't have all the answers to the question of ministry today. So I can't sum it all up for you in a brilliant flash like ministry is like a river. Instead, all I want to do is simply share with you some very modest thoughts that come to mind when you put the two words Francis and ministry together. I think the first thing we need to be aware of is that it would be pretentious to even suggest that at the outset we could give an adequate definition of ministry today. For it's a term that's undergoing considerable evolution in Catholic circles. As John Coleman, the sociologist, wrote in America not too long ago, today it seems that everyone either has or does ministry. Many new ministries, at least in the sense of our seeing them as ministries, have come into our purview in the last decade. Community organizing, ministry to divorced Catholics, ministry to gays, social ministry of advocacy, the ministry of liturgical planning, directed retreats, special ministers of the Eucharist, specialized ministries to the sick and the dying, and of course there are others. And I'm not, of course, suggesting that none of these things were ever done before the 1970s, but they were not named as such, reflected upon systematically, or organized and thought of as ministries before that time. So much for Coleman. So ministry, then, is a complicated idea. Its historical roots and its development are really only now being explored. Its relationship to priesthood is only now really being clarified. So Francis does not supply us with a neat formula for resolving all these open questions that exist in the topic of ministry. To admit that one doesn't have all wisdom, however, is not to say that one knows nothing. And if Francis cannot say it all, he can at least say some things to us, even if we live in a much different world than he. We can get some perspectives on truth, if not neat solutions. And that's all I want to offer to you for our reflection this morning, some perspectives from the life of Francis on the question of ministry. The little poor man of Assisi was rich in at least one thing, it seems to me: imagination. Francis was a man of vision. He had a dream. Not a dream in the sense of some sort of sleepy-headed musing, but a belief that could motivate him to change the present because he thought the future could be different. A vision that impelled him to live a certain way, to live and minister in a certain way. He had imagination. He could always see the possible and the potential in the actual. There's an old Irish saying. Have you ever noticed that all Irish sayings are old Irish sayings? It makes you wonder if the Irish said anything clever recently. You know? But the saying is, there are some homes so poor they never bred a dream. Well, if that be true, then Francis was a man who lived in a rich mansion. But like most acts of imagination, Francis's vision was a process. And the vision became clearer only in time. Remember when he first began to undergo his conversion, Francis used to pray in the little church of San Damiano, outside the Assisi town walls. There he prayed before the crucifix that hangs in Santa Clara now. Francis had a profound religious experience, as we all know, in that chapel, praying before that crucifix. He heard the voice of the Lord telling him, "Francis, rebuild my house." Well, the Lord was taken at his word, and Francis began to physically reconstruct churches in the area with brick and with mortar. In time, however, it became clear that the message entailed not a life of masonry for Francis, but a life of prophetic witness. Francis soon realized that the church to be rebuilt was not a particular building of stone, but the universal body of Christ. And that meant a different ministry than construction work. But if you're going to rebuild something, as we all know, you have to have a plan. You have to have a blueprint, some guide for your renovation. In short, Francis had to have a vision of the church he was seeking to rebuild. And what Francis envisioned was a church that would be poorer, closer to the people, one that took the primitive church as a model of community. And that raises the very first point I'd like to share with you today, or suggest for your consideration, that ministry is rooted in church. That you must have a vision of church before you deal with the question of ministry. So I might ask you simply, what is your vision of church? What would you hope the church to be like in the year 2000? Do you see a church that continues to be clerically dominated? A church that stands with the poor? What role is to be given women in the church of the future? Will it be a church that displays a diversity of lay ministries? How will leadership be exercised in the church of the future? The questions go on and on. But the focus of interest is your vision of church. Only if you have some conception of the church that you strive to serve and build can you then begin to delineate the main elements of your understanding of ministry, of what ministry should be like in that future church. If we can develop a coherent and a responsible vision of church, we can then ask ourselves, where do I fit in? How can I minister in that context? What service can I perform that would build the church we need for the year 2000? That vision may only come in time for us, as it did with Francis. But the vision can only become a reality if people like you and me refuse to have our lives defined for us by earlier generations. Now, a theology of ministry requires a knowledge of history. I don't want to deny that or dismiss that. But it also requires an ability to discern the future. For without a willingness to read the signs of the times in the light of the gospel, we will find a church relevant to the 20th century while we live in the 21st. All of this means that in some way you must define ministry. Its meaning for you. Francis himself said in his final testament, as you recall, "And the Lord gave me some brothers. There was nobody to show me what to do, but the Most High himself revealed to me that I was to live according to the form of the Holy Gospel." Francis, in other words, was not content to let others define ministry for him. He was, in a sense, the architect of a new style of ministry. With relation to the overall situation of clerics and religious in the medieval world, Francis promotes a new concept of religious life, living and working in the midst of other people, not in monastery walls. This work was not primarily clerical or ministerial in the ordained sense, for as we know, the original friars consisted of only very few priests and mainly lay brothers. To live in the midst of the people. That means far more than wearing the same designer clothes or going to the same restaurants as the people you serve. It means more than anything else going very deeply into the more difficult task of discovering what are the hopes and the fundamental aspirations of the people you serve. Of absorbing, insofar as it is possible with the gospel, the values and the ideals of that particular group, that particular world that you live in. Of joining the people in self-analysis and in social analysis, in real dialogue. And together with them, forming a truly local and a truly Christian community. So for us today, let me simply propose that we need a little bit of the courage of Francis, who saw that his call came from God, and he refused to allow other people to foist their expectations upon him. Surely one of the problems of any ministerial setting today in the church is that too often we allow our role to be defined for us, rather than defining it ourselves. Now, I'm not trying once again to do this in a sort of solipsistic way, in an excessively individualistic way. Because the process of definition is not a private thing, it's a communal discernment. But still, we should not confuse that with the case of those who simply assume an identity of minister as others define ministry. That this successfully deprives a person from investigating their gifts and how those gifts might best be used for the sake of the church. So today we have people who minister in a certain way, not because they are particularly good at it, or because they wanted to function in that manner, or even because they were needed to meet this role. Rather, they are this kind of minister because someone told them that's what they ought to do. I think almost any priest who served in a parish knows the anxiety of coming into a parish where every effort at service is greeted with the refrain, "When Father so-and-so was here, he didn't do it like that." Well, we should be very prudent in avoiding the mistakes that we've made as regards priestly ministry as we begin to develop and appreciate the emergence of lay ministry in the church. Namely, supposing that there is a very narrow range of possibilities to develop if we are to be identified as minister. Even more unfortunate than that would be our own self-imposed limits as to what ministry means and should be like. Imposed because we lack the imagination to define our role ourselves, and so are simply content to assume someone else's model of ministry. Francis, in other words, I'm suggesting, was not afraid to be different in his time, to stretch the boundaries of what passed for as the conventional wisdom regarding the meaning of ministry and religious life in his day. Neither should we be afraid. One of the great enemies of the gospel today is timidity. The minister, then, must not only root his or her ministry in the church, also must love the church. One of the major themes throughout Francis's life was his deep and abiding love for the church. That frequently maligned, sometimes embarrassing, but often profound community of people who gather in the Lord's name, church. Where Francis differed from other enthusiasts of his time who wandered beyond the Catholic communion was that Francis not only loved his vision of the church, he loved the actual church before him. We believe that Christ is known to us only through the incarnation. That the God of the Bible is a God of time and a God of space. He has entered into history in an irrevocable way. That is how and where we must love him, in history, in the human dimensions of spatiality and temporality. And so Francis encountered the living God in the elements of nature, in the flesh and blood of other persons, in the events that we call sacraments. Francis met God in the experience of church, of being part of a particular people. And that's an essential aspect, it seems to me, of Francis's genius. That while loving and believing very strongly in a vision of the future, he never lost love for the reality before him. The danger is always that we become so wrapped up in the church that we become very unlovingly critical of the church that is. Every one of us has their list of favorite faults of the Catholic Church. I won't bore you with mine. Francis wasn't blind to the sin of the church in his day, the sin that resided in the church, but he loved it nonetheless. Monsignor George Higgins always says, it's easy to love the holy church, but can you love the unholy one? Francis illustrates the importance of answering yes to that question if we are to truly be Franciscans, if we are to truly be successful ministers. While I'm at it, talking about love, let me also point it out that Francis loved his ministry. He was called the troubadour of God. He even legislated joy in chapter 7 of the Rule, 1221. He says, the brothers should become and show themselves joyful and content in the Lord, merry and becomingly courteous. We all know that no one skips through life with a perpetual smile of joy. But if joy is habitually absent, there's a real credibility gap for oneself and for the world regarding the value of such a calling. So as ministers, we need to spare ourselves grim determination. I remember an older friar, even one more ancient than Father Stephen, who once said to me, be enthused or be gone. That attitude is important for ministry because it is the underpinning of a ministry that's creative. By creative, I'm not talking about gimmicks. What I'm talking about is a continuing quest for the best way, the most apt way of serving the needs of people. All of us are tempted to carry out our ministries year in, year out, without examining them critically, to see how we can improve. Ministry then becomes mechanical. perfunctory. Joy is the antidote for that. For our deepest joy can spring from taking delight in serving others. And in turn, then, that joy gives rise to enthusiasm. And it's enthusiasm for ministry that motivates us enough to be discontented with our present effectiveness, to desire growth in ministry, so that we can serve better. If you are not really in love with your work, that is, if you are not really in love with your people, then sooner or later you stop doing ministry effectively. Sooner or later you stop loving well, which is all ministry is. In his later years, you may recall, Francis used to speak fairly frequently of an event that he considered personally significant. As a young man, he had a particular distaste for lepers. And of course, that was an attitude shared by many in medieval society. Remember that his tale of how one day he's riding on horseback when he encounters the leper on the road. We all know from our reading of Francis, his first reaction is to ride off another way, as he had done so often in his early life. Instead, he leaps off the horse, places some alms into the man's hands, and then he makes that dramatic gesture that in retrospect, years later, he perceives as a real conversion in his life. He kisses the man. From that time on, Francis would see himself as having a very special bond with those who are disadvantaged. His kissing of the leper was an acting out, you might say, of what liberation theologians call a preferential option for the poor. That is, it was to be with the humblest, with the least, that Francis would identify. Each of us, if we look at our lives, we can understand our lives really as a series of concentric circles in terms of our relationships. Family and close friends in the center of those circles, and each larger circle including a wider group of friends and acquaintances and passers-by. The question which Francis puts to us really is, who stands in the outermost circle of your life? Who is on the periphery? Who have you marginalized from your sense of awareness and concern? If we're truthful, I think, we must admit that there are some people whom we minister to who make it a pleasure to serve them. There are those who are always grateful for our small deeds, and they pay us back. Dinner invitations, friendship, kind words, Christmas cards, joyful letters. Some make themselves very easy to love, for they give to us as well as receive from us. But what of the people we serve who are boring or boorish, who never bother to say thanks? The old person whose stories you've heard too many times before. The teenager who is not engaging and charming, but merely a hanger-on. Do they get the same attention as those who are attractive to you? G.K. Chesterton, in his Life of Francis, wrote, "There never was a man who looked into those brown, burning eyes without being certain that Francis Bernardone was really interested in him." That is not an easy virtue to cultivate. To minister to all, and not just those who please us. Yet ministry, if it is gospel ministry, excludes no one. We must reach out to the ones who are on the periphery of our concern, both those near at hand, in our communities here, in our parishes, in our schools, in our hospitals, in our workplaces, also the distant neighbor in far-off lands who may be denied human rights. In the Franciscan scheme of things, it seems to me the essential work of ministry is simply the lived reality of a commitment. More important than the kind of work engaged in is the way the work is done. I've often thought one of the most attractive things about Francis was precisely that he did not define acceptable ministries for his friars. What he defined was a lifestyle and left it to the friars to work out for themselves what work they were to do. Throughout his life, Francis refused to limit the friars to an approved list of apostolates. Any work that did not hinder the spiritual life was acceptable to Francis. The vital element was the quality of one's life. Now, working in the seminary, I'm filled with lingo, and if I were to put that into the lingo of pastoral field directors today in seminaries, we might say that for Francis, an absolutely valid aspect of ministry is a ministry of presence. That is, simply striving to live out one's faith in the midst of others, by building communities of love and service, by living in poverty and earning our way, by sharing in the hopes of the poor. We can be a sign of the kingdom. Or to use Segundo's phrase, we can be artisans of a new humanity. Francis bids us to remember that our very first contribution to building the church is a way of life that bears witness to Jesus. There is a lot more that could be said on any of the topics I've mentioned, but I want to end simply with a lesson that Francis would insist upon whenever he talked to his brothers: the absolute necessity of prayer. For Francis, it was simply a matter of fact that the minister would be a person of prayer. In the second biography, written by Celano, Francis says, "If the body takes its food, so too the soul must be nourished by its food, God." And at another point, while talking about the ministry of preaching, he said, "A preacher ought first in secret prayer to draw the water he intends later to pour out. He ought to grow warm within before he utters cold words without." It should not be a revelation then for us to say that prayer is the bedrock of ministry. Without it as a minister, in my grandmother's words, you won't be worth a tinker's dam. You might snow a few people. All of us have some ministerial skills that we can employ to get by. But sooner or later you'll find that the ministry behind, or the motivation behind your ministry changes. After a while, you start to work for yourself. The plaudits, the recognition, the popularity, the power that comes from ministry. Prayer purifies us. It helps us to center on God, not on ourselves. So that in our ministry, we say it because it's true, and we do it because it's right, not because it will be acclaimed. One of the first to follow Francis, of course, was Bernard of Quintavalli. Remember that before joining Francis, he had to allay his suspicions about whether Francis was simply a sort of disenchanted rich child passing through some phase. So he invites Francis to dinner and to stay overnight. Remember that night, after feigning sleep for the sake of Bernard, Francis arose and he knelt in prayer, unaware that Bernard is watching Francis all the time. Francis spent the entire night saying the same words again and again: "My God and my all." And then just before dawn, remember, he slips back into bed before Bernard is likely to arise. The next day, having seen all this, Bernard decides to follow Francis. I always wondered why Francis said the same words again and again. It was not the most attractive style of prayer in my mind. I remember when I was a novice and filled with some enthusiasm, not to say I have none now, but filled with a lot then, I tried to do the same thing. I was bored trying to pray that way. It's only recently, really, in all honesty, only the last few months, that I've come to see the dynamic at work that night in a season. Francis kept saying the same prayer over and over again, it seems to me, in the hope that sooner or later he would say it and really mean it. It takes a long time to say something and really mean what you say. None of us would be impressed by the adolescent who pledges love to his girlfriend on the first date. We might find it cute. We might call it puppy love. We might say he feels something, the stirring of his sexuality, affection for another person, pleasure in her company. Would we call it love? Hardly. Doesn't come that soon. Certainly doesn't come that easy. It will take years for him to say, I love you, and really mean it. So too with our prayer and our conversation with God. It has to be said again and again if it's to be said with sincerity. My God and my all. We need to purify our intent through prayer. Well, where does that leave us? Is ministry like a river? Well, I would suggest that, like a river, ministry can overwhelm us, and we can drown in it. That like whitewater rapids, ministry has its moments of excitement. And like the rapids, you can wind up dashed upon the rocks. Ministry has its quiet, placid times too, like the gentle flow of a great river. Like a mountain river, ministry can refresh you, it can chill you. But is it truly like a river? I don't know for sure. What I do know is that it is a great grace to minister to others. It's a privilege. It's a grace that I hope all of us receive throughout our life. And I simply want to suggest that our prayer today should be that as we go out today, we go out and we see ourselves as ministers, as true ministers of God, as troubadours of God. That we can call ourselves ministers of the Lord and really mean it. Thanks. Should we stretch first and then reassemble, or want to stretch?
Rising up out of
While I'm still moving it hard.
Oh, I'm sorry.
We're on the recorder, girls. Anyone who doesn't want to go down for posterity.
Keep it clean.
One of the things, Father, that we have, Amita Borelli used to talk about the sacrament of the moment, which is exactly what, you almost said those words there, or maybe you did. And it was so close to it anyway. She believed in the sacrament of the moment, to live the moment, to see what the moment said to you, and see what you should do, because back in that moment, God was saying, help this thing, or do this thing, or act. That's been a big influence to me.
Yeah, I think Barbara and I were talking during the break there, and we were saying that we were agreeing that I think, one of the things that we need to do really is help people to see the dignity of their work, that all work is possible ministry and has that dignity. All work can be seen as doing the Lord's work. If we don't fall into this trap of defining ministry too narrowly, if we don't fall into this trap of trying to set up classes of privilege, that there are some who are ministers and some who aren't, or some who are ordained ministers, that we're always trying to differentiate ourselves from others and setting up little castes. And I think one of the things we have to really try to labor against is to avoid that. And I think in doing that, we really will help people to see that very often, the simple work of everyday life is ministry. And that has a dignity to it. And it's really a privilege to do that. And it's a great service to the Christian community. And I think that that's something that Francis can remind us, that all labor has a dignity if it's understood as doing the Lord's work and with that sort of motivation behind it. And I think it's I really worry that we're going to distort the word ministry, just as we've distorted priesthood and other terms, that we're going to define it very narrowly, and then we're going to set up distinctions within the Christian community as to who really is a minister and who isn't. I think that would be horrible.
But Father, one of the things that you said that I believe is not understood is that historically ministry began many years ago. It's nothing new.
That's right.
But it is a new understanding because we have new needs.
Mm-hmm.
And I think some people do establish the church said, but I don't think the church really said. Some people heard that priest saying, or that bishop, and that is the church. But when you go down to the documents of Vatican II, there is a new beginning understanding, but isn't the new everything. That is one thing that when you were speaking, but also you mentioned the having a vision. And sometimes our vision, it's knowing the history of the past, but the vision is something to come, and we are afraid of the new things. And that was another thing that touched me. And then was the third one, the critical review of what is happening in my life, my ministerial approach, and am I doing with love because this is my ministry at the moment. And I think that really takes much deeper understanding of self, where I'm going, what is this doing to the growth of the community that I live in, whatever it is, because it is a community we are building up. And I thought that is really excellent of self-review, not before I go out there, but sometimes you have to go out there, and the critical review is painful. Because if I have a little vision or a big vision, I am wanted to give a message which is not mine. I'm impelled by or whatever, but the message is not understood, the message is not accepted, and that brings a lot of suffering. That is a part of this ministry or call that we have in order to grow. Something has to done, and I think that is very painful. And sometimes I personally, and I'm sure many others, are afraid to make other people realize what the Lord is doing or the message, and I think it's very, very painful. And I was very, very pleased to hear that prayer is the essential ingredient.
I think precisely to bear that pain, Nancy, it is, in the sense of if, it's very easy, I happened to be in a very fortunate experience when I first got out and was first ordained, and I was sent out to a parish in New Jersey. And it was easy to be a minister. It was a breeze. Everything you did was great. It was the first time they ever had a newly ordained priest in their parish. It was an older parish. They had never had a young priest before. Well, I could have stood on my head, and they would have thought this was the most creative insight they'd ever heard before. Anything I did was applauded, cheered, great, wonderful. Well, who can't minister in that setting? I mean, the affirmation and the validation was incredible. I mean, literally every day you're getting applause from people. But if I'm staying in ministry for that, well, it was easy there. But when I left there, then all of a sudden, some other place, well, you're just another Joe. And then, some of the things you do, fine. Some of the things you do, you're a nut, And then you say to yourself, well, all of a sudden the applause isn't as much, and it's not. Well, then, why do you stay? Or do you leave there and go back to the place where you know you can get applause? I think what keeps you in there is precisely if your motivation is, and we all have mixed motives, obviously, but if you're increasingly purifying your motivation, you hang in there in the tough times precisely because that's not why you're a minister, so that you can get applause. You're not a minister because you're getting all this gratification. You're a minister because you're in love with the Lord. And it's precisely if you're beginning to enter into that relationship seriously, then you can roll with the punches. It doesn't make the pain any less real, but you can endure the pain.
How do you spoke about your work, everyday work being in ministry? I have had the experience, and I know several people do. I think they sometimes think of work and that thing as being servile. I mean, I know somebody who can see the difference between being servile and serving someone. I mean, I think it's the underlying idea of you're serving with love in Christ's name, doing it. And this was a Christian woman. She just, anything you did for anybody else, you just looked on it as if you were being servile or something like that. You weren't supposed to do that. She always downplayed that and demanded a lot of, I mean, that was one example, I know, but I think a lot of people look on that.
I think you're right. Yeah, I think you're right. I think, the great lesson of Holy Thursday really is, the washing of the feet. But I think most of us, I think it comes out even in the way when we celebrate that. You ever, like, you're in big churches at Holy Thursday, most people find that mildly amusing. It's not a ritual that most people really see as touching their lives. It's kind of silly, And what's even sillier, of course, is the incongruity. If you have some priest doing this who hasn't served anybody or is as pompous as can be, he does this. People perceive the incongruity here. That this is not a person who's a servant, or doesn't at least have that demeanor about them. Well, I think that's a constant, effort for us is precisely to see the dignity of service, and I think most of us, at different times, don't. And I mean, I do the same thing. I'm sure you have too. There are times when you think to yourself, the last thing I ought to do is let that person get the better of me, or let that person walk all over me, or I'm not going to be a fool for that person. We all have that, I think, instinct to rebel at being a servant. But I think it's a constant sort of challenge that we're confronted with.
It's very interesting here, Father, at the Villa. We will have some people who go down the line, and you can tell that the way they treat you when you're standing behind the line, that they must do this every day when they go out to the cafeteria.
Yeah.
And then if we give them a little talk and we tell them how we're volunteers and so on, the next time they go down the line, their treatment of you is very different.
It's interesting.
And it's interesting to watch this. We have elevated ourselves somehow or other in their eyes. We're no longer just the servants back here who are, getting minimum wage, so to speak.
Yeah.
We're different.
Yeah.
It's very interesting to watch this. And I remember one time when Joyce was a director, this one woman in a group had only seen us, back here, back of the counter, and then she was out in the big room and she was looking for where do you connect the microphone and how do I do this, and Joyce just happened to walk out, and she started to ask Joyce the question about the microphone, and then she stopped right in the middle and she said, oh, well, you wouldn't know anything about that, you only work in the kitchen. And Joyce just looked at her and she said, well, I'm the director, what, may I help you? And the woman was so embarrassed, she didn't know how to answer that. But that, that showed. It was interesting.
Yeah. And I guess part of the other interesting thing is in terms of how it rankles you the way some people treat you and others don't.
Well, I was just going to say
that whole thing about that.
Actually, when we first opened the house and I first came, it was a real test for me to take some of that because I'd always been on the other side of the fence, and it was really a hard lesson for me to learn, to smile and mean it at that point.
Yeah.
It really was. It took me a long time to really learn how to do that gracefully.
And I think it's that point about there are some people who it's very easy to serve. It's a pleasure to serve some people. There are other people who make it really tough to be a servant to them.
One very graphic time on this, I went into the hallway in the evenings, I'm making night rounds, and there was a woman on a pilgrimage here, and she came across that hallway and she was gritting her teeth and she was going to straighten this place out, I'll tell you. And she landed in front of me and said that I think it was her teeth wasn't on. And I said, well, let me see what's wrong. And I went with her, and the fan wasn't on, that's all. The heat was there, she just wasn't getting the effect of it. I turned the fan on, I said, there, the heat is coming up. She could feel it. She turned around to me, and she just put her arms around me and kissed me goodnight. It was just such an absolute, forgive me for what I just did, because when she was hitting me, I met her in the hall. Next morning, she was all smiling.
However, the more complex our society becomes, the more we have to deal with this continually, because people have different statuses and they have different, more developed talents than others and so forth, and ability to serve. And in order to, shall we say, make your way, you have to be aware of the power of certain people. You have to, well, ingratiate yourself to certain people, whereas the other people, you know, you can say hello to, but you don't really make a point of it. And it seems to me, you know, it's a continual thing to do. If you, well, I mean, that's what it is. I mean, whether you like it or not, Mary, you have to.
The power structure.
If you get in trouble with the boss, I mean, right? It seems to me that you're
You
not
have to
going
go
to
to
get
his
a
good
raise
side.
the next week or whatever.
You have to get back on his good side.
To think about in terms of the motif of the temple of the living God. As you know, a temple, or church for that matter, or chapel, is actually a place of worship through word and sacrifice. And this is conducted by, or carried on by, the assembly of the people. The study of ancient religions, pagan or Jewish, are all in conformity with this understanding of worship. Granted that their worship may have been false, may have been shut through with idolatry, but the basic notion is still there. A place for people to gather, for people to come in contact with their deity or deities, a place to speak to him, and a place to offer sacrifice. Actually, the sign of the temple can be seen more explicitly in terms of 7 manifestations of God for the purpose of dwelling with his people. The first temple that God himself built, it was not made by hand, was indeed the universe itself. It was wonderfully adorned by all the various works of God's creation. And these works themselves, just like visual aids that we would have in any modern church or chapel, all bespoke the various attributes of God, whether his power, his wisdom, his goodness, his truth. The universe itself declares the glory of the living God. And indeed, this might well have sufficed during the history of the human race, were it not for the fact that sin entered into the world and the minds of human beings were turned away from the living God to worship idols of all kinds, things which they themselves manufactured or made, statues, stones, venerated in high places, in which it was thought that some contact could be established between an unseen divinity and yet one worshipped or believed to inhabit either the various planets above or the stones and trees and animals, in fact, on earth. Even the sea itself, with its great manifestation of power when the sea was angry, is considered to have been the dwelling place of a deity, in some instances, the evil spirits themselves. And so it was that in God's divine designs, designs to reveal himself more and more clearly to his human beings. That at the time of Moses, once the people were delivered from the land of slavery, namely from Egypt, and brought into the desert, that there was a long period of time in which God's people could receive new religious education. And Moses was the chief educator appointed by God, and indeed given or sharing in God's Spirit to explain God's will for the upbuilding of the people into a temple. Not just one expressed in terms of the various appurtenances of what was called the tabernacle in the desert, but one which would be greatly helped and nourished by this visual manifestation of a design in which God's place in their midst might be ever present to them, but yet the tabernacle itself was not a substitute for the living presence of God. Granted that God, who ordered it to be built, was willing to be worshipped there, and even explained how the worship was to be conducted. But the purpose from the very start was that their minds and hearts would be turned towards him. That with their minds, with their intellect, they would accept his ordinances, his commands, believe him to be the supreme being, the only God before whom there must never be strange gods, that they would worship him alone, and that their moral life would correspond to this true worship of God. And so we listen today to the Ten Commandments as they are found in the book of Exodus, and as they were revealed to the people when they were having this desert experience, this place apart, free from the bad influences of pagan peoples, where they could concentrate on God's will in their regard and be fashioned into a free people, a worshiping people, a holy priesthood, a royal priesthood rather, and a holy nation. And every one of these appurtenances are later spoken of or referred to in the letter to the Hebrews, in which the true purpose, the inner meaning, as well as that prophetic meaning which pointed to a time and a place and a person through whom far greater, deeper, and more perfect worship would be rendered to the Most High God. If then we speak of the universe as being the first of God's temples, which he himself erected, the second, namely the tabernacle in the desert, and for that matter the temple of Solomon that followed, because it was the same design, the continuation of the same worship, except on a far more elaborate scale. And it was not a tent that was folded up and moved about from place to place in the desert, when God himself was willing to be regarded almost like a pilgrim God who was wandering around with them, though actually he was himself developing them into a free people, as just mentioned, a worshiping people. Later, in the time of the settlement of the land that he had promised them, he would be willing to be worshipped in a more permanent structure, namely in the city of Jerusalem, where the full liturgy could be carried out. But always and in every instance, it was not the building so much or the appurtenances, all of which had a certain place, but rather the reform of the life of the individual. The Ten Commandments are the basic moral law. And when Christ came, the new Moses, who is revealed to us in these scriptures, he showed how the application of these basic moral laws, basic principles of moral conduct, were to be applied not merely to external actions which were commanded or forbidden, depending on whether they were positive or negative commands or prohibitions, but rather that they were to be sublimated in terms of affecting even the life of one's soul, one's thoughts, one's words, besides the actions of the human person. And this caused the fulfillment of the divine command to reach a higher level, where it would be possible for the whole person, the mind and the heart, to be truly converted to God, and thereby become a worthy temple of the living God. The third of the temples was indeed also made by God, not made by the hands of men, as was the tabernacle in the desert, and that was the person of the incarnate Word. It was Jesus Christ, Son of God and Son of Man, who, particularly in and through his human nature and through his very body, was the visible manifestation of God dwelling among men, no longer dependent upon a single place or a single structure, but rather to be adored in spirit and in truth wherever the temple of the living God would be. Granted, during Christ's earthly life, it was where he was, where he would travel to in order to preach the Holy Gospel, and there was considerable limitation there because he never left his own country. But in view of his foreseen passion, death, and resurrection, and sending of the Spirit, that body, that temple of the living God, the person of Jesus Christ, would indeed be poured out upon the church and would constitute a new people, a new creation, a new temple, where God would indeed be worshipped in spirit and in truth. The fourth temple then, I should say the fifth temple, would be the church. The church considered as the corporate body of believers and worshippers of God. And then another manifestation of his presence, another form of temple, would be his presence in the Eucharist, which can indeed be regarded as a temple of the living God because it's intended to be given to the individual believer. And in and through its distribution among the new people of God, it would keep the life of the Christ, the true temple of God, alive in the people, in individuals and in all individuals who together constitute the church. There's only one further manifestation of that divine presence still to be awaited, and that would be the temple called the New Jerusalem, the church in glory, when all these furnishings of which we speak, of which the scriptures speak, will no longer be necessary. There will not even be needed the light of the sun or the moon, because God himself will be the light, and all of us will see fully in his light. All of us will love fully in and through the love of God's Son for the Father and for all of us. Reverting once again to the purpose for which temples exist, which was explained a moment ago, namely a place of worship in word and sacrifice on the part of a people, we discover then that Jesus accomplishes in himself this purpose. He is the temple of the living God, as he said, destroy this temple. And the disciples didn't understand then, but later he was talking about the temple of his body. So he then accomplishes in himself the perfect sacrifice of praise and expiation. He worships by word and also by sacrifice, the sacrifice of himself. The words pertain to the truth, and he is the truth. The words pertain to the way, expressed not just in terms of 10 Commandments, but in the living example of a life lived in perfect harmony with God and in genuine love of neighbor, a life which is also a sacrifice, an atonement, an expiation for the sins of all mankind, so that freed from sins they would be more acceptable. Their praise and worship would be more acceptable to the Most High God, because it would blend with and be a continuation of, an extension of, the very worship which the Son of God made man gave to the Father, and he was precisely destined to be the incarnate Word and became such in order to be the supreme worshiper of God. That is why whatever he did or said, wherever he was, there was the temple of the living God, giving true praise to God and doing so among men, among human beings. In his person, he unites all men in a close and universal communion. And the Eucharist which we receive is the sign, the sacrament of this union, which nourishes the very life of the one who is the perfect worshiper of the Most High God and helps us to share in that life. We are greatly confirmed in our belief by words that came from the great preacher of the gospel, namely Paul of Tarsus, in which he tells us in the first letter to the Corinthians, "Are you not aware that you are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwells in you? And if anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him." That is the greatest dignity that we could possess, namely to be temples, whether considered corporately as one temple or individually as temples of the living God, because the Spirit of God, that same Spirit that overshadowed Mary and caused her to be with child, the same Spirit that hovered over the apostles, over Mary in the upper room and caused the church to come into being as the extension of Christ, giving birth to this new creation, this mystical body of Christ as it's called. That same Spirit was given to you, conferred upon you, poured out upon you at the time of your baptism, the time of your baptismal consecration, which made of you, small as you were, just an infant, or later in life, if no baptism was received in childhood, but at whatever time it occurred, you became a temple of the living God. We are told further in that same letter that you must know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit, who is within. That Spirit who lives in you and which you have received from God. And as a result, you are not your own. You belong to God. You have been purchased at a price to glorify God in your body. And so the last of the points for our consideration is the effort at trying to understand more realistically, and therefore to respond more genuinely and more deeply to the exalted dignity to which each of us has been called to be a temple of the living God, an extension of Christ, another Christ, one who joins in this supreme worship given by Christ when during the Eucharistic sacrifice we say, through him and in him and with him we give all honor and glory to you, eternal Father, in the unity of the Holy Spirit. All honor and glory is given to God. That indeed gives supreme pleasure to the adorable Trinity, because of the perfect effect which the life, death, and resurrection of the Son is having, always had in the individual person of Christ, and continues to have ever more fully in the whole church or assembly of God's people. What then does it mean to you individually to be a temple of God? It means in the first place that you are a sacred place, a sacred person, sacred to separate you from the profane, an action which runs through the whole of the revelation in the Old Testament and reaches its greater clarity in the New, a sacred person. A sacred person destined for God's exclusive use, for the use which God intends to be made of this sacred person which you are. And keeping in mind, or keeping in the background, the life of Francis responding to the command to build up God's house, or rebuild it within himself and in the church, we can see from his response how he went about it. He began, as it were, to look at the foundations of that dwelling of God within himself, namely at that which relates what makes up your being, body and soul, how those essential components of your existence and being relate to God. If your body is not your own, but is given to you as an extension of the sacred humanity of Christ, and indeed it is in the first place sacred, and it must be used in accordance with God's laws, his commandments, sublimated to include words and as well as thoughts, so that he can dwell there. It must not be desecrated. You think of the wide prevalence of immorality or misuse of what was intended to be a temple of the Holy Spirit, or temples of God, the use that is made for the very opposite purpose, might say a diabolical one, then indeed we get some idea of the tremendous contrast between what the body should not be and also what indeed it should be. Granted that human nature being as it is, there is a constant struggle to keep this vessel of ours, known as our human body, pure and worthy of the one who dwells in it. But with the grace of God, we can indeed accomplish that. Then as far as intellect and will are concerned, the intellect exists to know and to further pursue the truth of which Christ possesses the fullness. He is the truth. And it is in the discovery of that truth, not just as some abstract idea, but of living truth, namely that the articles of the Holy Creed contain that which was foretold and fulfilled in preparation for your coming into existence, so that you would have that benefit of the truth. The realization then that you are temples of the living God should indeed become within you, within each of us, a living truth that is constantly before us. And then our will, brought into conformity with the will of God, as Christ's will was conformed to the Father's will, that indeed makes the foundation of your existence a solid and worthy foundation for being a temple of the living God. So that the evangelical counsels, and that's what we've been referring to, become the basis of the sacredness of this temple or holy place which you are. The further adornments of this temple to keep it sacred and holy would be the various virtues through which likeness to Christ becomes ever more visible, more attractive, and more effective in giving witness to Christ among others. All of these become part of the challenge that is laid down before us in living out this consecrated life. And then when all this is well along in the process of accomplishment, as indeed it is through the many graces given to you, then the further question is, now that we've built a temple, I should say, now that God has built a temple in you, what's it to be used for? Well, we already said what the purpose of a temple is, a place of worship. And this, of course, involves your prayer life. where God is to be adored in spirit and in truth, and where deeper insights are granted to you in terms of the reality of this great mystery of which you are part, so that an appreciation, a love for what has been accomplished in you may grow ever deeper and draw from you a more and more complete or total response of love, which is the language of sacrifice, the language of prayer, so that word and sacrament are combined not just during the short period of time required to confect the Eucharistic sacrifice, but rather continued throughout the day. If Christ indeed is, and we firmly believe that he is the supreme worshipper of the Most High God, then wherever he was, whatever he did, and whatever he said was worship. And we are joined to him. And then through our vocation to be Christians and to be further and more maturely consecrated through our special calling. And that does indeed mean that to be a continuous temple of the living God means that what you think and do and say must be turned into worship. There must be no division in our lives, as though when we're deeply involved in business matters we're simply a business person, or we're engaged in the profane world and we can be considered such, or secular in the sense of secularistic. And then later on, when we are alone or when we get to a temple built by hands, that we can then be a worshiper of God. No such dichotomy is possible. Or those who are the temple of the living God called to the acceptance of the gospel. Some further thoughts on this great mystery left to yourselves to accomplish, particularly during this holy season, can indeed enrich and more attractively adorn that dwelling of Christ within you, in which he finds his pleasure, in which he turns you into a restored temple or house of God, restored from the danger of it being ruined or falling into ruin to being indeed a temple of the Most High God, which no one can destroy, or if someone were to attempt it, God would destroy the destroyer. But we are here to build up. It's for this intention that we offer the Eucharistic sacrifice this morning. It is our custom always to offer it for you on this day of retreat. This will be our special intention.